And lastly here, Marcus writes in both MLB and pro wrestling, athletes have used steroids for Herculean results and greater fame. Unfortunately, steroids have also hurt both sports in damning ways. My question is, which sport did steroids have the biggest impact on? Major League Baseball or professional wrestling? That is a great question. Steroids, PEDs have had a huge impact on both. In terms of baseball, who really knows how far back the usage of performance-enhancing drugs go? You can go back to the Bash Brothers with Canseco and Mark McGwire in the late 80s. I'm sure people were using much earlier than that. But what happened was, baseball, they went on strike, and it was in 94. I want to say it was in 94 that, they had no World Series. Baseball came back, and it was kind of dead. And what resuscitated the sport? It was the home run chase, right, in the late 90s with Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. And then along came Barry Bonds and his fat head, literally his fat head, in the early 2000s. And all of these monsters started hitting home runs out of the ballpark, 40, 50, 60 home run seasons. And that's what brought people into the ballpark. It became a hitter's game. Everybody was hitting home runs. I mean, who doesn't want to go to a baseball game and see home runs, right? It's boring to a lot of people to go to a ball game, let alone watch one on TV and see a pitcher's duel. Some people are excited by that. Most people aren't. They want to see people bashing balls out of the ballpark. And so that really is what helped resuscitate the game of baseball. Whether, you believe they turned a blind eye to it, Bud Selig and all them, who knows? They probably did. There was a lot of that stuff going on back then. And that brought in millions, even billions of dollars. Okay, and the big TV contract that MLB signed, all of that stems from the game gaining in popularity, which largely happened because of steroid use. But I would say this, despite the huge impact it had on Major League Baseball, professional wrestling by far. The answer has to be pro wrestling in terms of the impact that steroid use had on the two industries. You can look at the finances of it and say that baseball may have reaped more financial rewards overall. They may have made more money. It's a much bigger industry financially than wrestling is. I look at the human toll as being more important than the financial toll. And you look at the human toll of steroid use in pro wrestling over the years. And steroid use in pro wrestling goes back to at least the 60s. This is not something like only wrestlers started using steroids in the 70s and 80s. And don't be naive, okay? It goes back further than that. But in the 80s, WWF became national. That they became the number one company in the country. They started expanding. Hogan was just the poster child for WWF. And he was also the poster child for steroids. And then that whole thing with the Arsenio Hall show where he went on the show and he lied, he embarrassed himself, and brought all of this undue scrutiny from the government onto the company. Vince McMahon almost ended up going to jail. It was a whole sequence of events. So, and it could have been a lot worse. Vince could well have gone to jail, and he had a plan in place for Jerry Jarrett to take over, but Vince was still going to run day-to-day operations from prison. All of these wacky things that happened. But I look at the human toll, and I look at all the people that have died. Now, you can say, well, you can't say that all those wrestlers died because of steroids. And that's true. A lot of those guys were doing a lot of other bad shit they shouldn't have been doing. For all the guys that were probably shooting up with needles in the 80s, in the NWA, and WWE, and everywhere else, they were probably doing cocaine. In fact, cocaine was a big thing back in the 80s. That's why when they first put a drug policy in place in 87, it was to cover cocaine. I don't think it covered steroids. It was to curb cocaine use, which was at an all-time high. And Hogan, I think, is an admitted coke user. You don't have to really have him admit to that. Just go watch any of his old promos and watch any of the old Randy Savage promos and everybody else back in the day. They were all coked-up monsters. I wouldn't be surprised if on the set of No Holds Barred in 89, Vince is in his trailer with Hogan and all they're doing is snorting coke off a fucking stripper's tits. Probably stuff like that was going on a lot back then. That was the 80s. Scarface, you ever see that movie? So it was happening a lot back then. There was a lot of street drugs and narcotics beyond just steroids that were being taken. And a lot of guys died because of recreational drug abuse back then. but you can't discount the impact that steroids had. How many enlarged hearts have we heard about? How many enlarged hearts have we heard about? Whatever kind of steroid it was, growth hormone, whatever it was, in massive amounts. Right up until recent years. It wasn't just contained to the 80s and 90s. Guys that were doing that shit in the 80s and 90s paid a very heavy price for that, and so did their families. And so did wrestling. All the scrutiny. I mean, wrestling is a punchline to a lot of people. Oh, wrestling, those guys don't live to be beyond the age of 40. And, it's almost like a joke, but it's not. How many guys never made it out of their 30s? How many guys never made it out of their 40s? That's not normal. So when you compare the rate of steroid deaths in baseball, and there have been guys that have died from admitted steroid use or alleged steroid abuse, but when you compare the rate of guys that have dropped dead at a young age, 30s, 40s, 50s, from PED and steroid abuse in Major League Baseball, whatever that number is, and you compare that number to the number in wrestling, there is no comparison. There is no way that those numbers are comparable. The numbers in wrestling far exceed any that you would find in baseball. No other sport has the reputation that wrestling has of having so many young deaths from steroid use. So for that reason alone, wrestling wins or loses, depending on your perspective here. But I think the bigger impact has been felt by pro wrestling. I don't care how much money baseball made off of the home run chase in the late 90s and them turning a blind eye all those years and Bonds and everybody else. And they made a shit ton of money off that. And they paid a very heavy price PR-wise for that later on. The bigger impact in terms of human life is on pro wrestling. And just being a form of entertainment that was so reliant upon looking a certain way and wrestlers feeling as though I have to look a certain way. Whether they were outright told by the promoter or if it was suggested to them. How many stories have we heard of that in the WWF where, Vince didn't tell somebody, hey, get on the gas, but, you should get on the gas. And so guys felt that to keep their spot on the roster, they had to do certain things to look a certain way. I mean, look at a guy like Lance Cade. I just watched the Shawn Michaels Chris Jericho ladder match from No Mercy in 2008. Great frickin' match, by the way. Just a random match I picked on the network that I haven't seen in a long time. That I know Jericho talks about it in his book, which I've got to read. I haven't started it yet. So I said I'm going to watch that match, and I watched it, and it was a great match. And I had completely forgotten that towards the finish, Lance Cade had gotten involved, because at that time, Lance Cade was aligned with Chris Jericho. I had completely forgotten about that. And Cade was also somebody who had been trained many years earlier by Shawn Michaels, so there was that tie-in as well. And I'm watching this, and Cade is leaving with Jericho, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure he died like the following year, and sure enough, he did. And I went back and I started reading up again on Lance Cade, because he had passed away about 3 or 4 years ago at this point. And, you hear stories from guys that worked in the company at that time who interacted with him about how he really didn't want to take steroids, but he felt compelled to, or somebody had kind of intimated to him that, we need you to look a certain way. He was frustrated, I think, at that time. Either he had not been called up or they weren't doing anything with him. So he did. He did whatever he did to look the way he had to look, and then all of a sudden, he got called up. And so you read story, and he's just one example of that I give, because I just so happened to watch a match where he was featured in the other day. But that was in the 2000s. So again, this is not something like, well, that's a generation removed, and everything now is so much different, and we have the wellness policy. That's great. That's terrific, and I'm happy they have that wellness policy now, and I'm sure it's the strongest it's ever been. And I'm sure overall that steroid use in WWE is probably lower than it's ever been, although I think you're fooling yourself if you don't think that guys there aren't on growth hormone. Of course, they're still on something. But that aside, this is not like old hat, people. Like, this is still going on. And a lot of people are no longer around because just the culture of wrestling being what it is, they felt like this is what I have to do. And that's their choice. I mean, look, I'm not excusing their behavior. A lot of those guys that passed away because they abused steroids and they found their hearts were enlarged, nobody put a gun to their head and said, listen, you got to take this shit. They made that choice. That's their responsibility. Everyone should be responsible for their own choices, but that doesn't make it any less sad. I do believe there were plenty of guys who, if they had the choice, would never have gotten involved in stuff like that. But it's wrestling, or I need my spot, Vince loves big guys, whatever the case may be. So it was like it pervaded that culture for so long. You can't say that, it didn't have a massive impact on wrestling from just the fact that people felt like they had to do it, still might feel that way, and then the loss of life. Find me another industry. Find me another sport or form of entertainment where as many people have died at a young age from steroid use, growth hormone, whatever, than in pro wrestling. How many dead bodies are in pro wrestling compared to baseball? There is no comparison. You're not finding guys. I mean, you could probably go back right now and find guys that were on Major League Baseball winning World Series teams in the mid-'80s and the late '80s and the early '90s. And not every single one of them are going to be around. But by and large, those teams are probably mostly still, if not completely in some cases, still intact. Those people are still living and breathing. How many WrestleManias, how many pay-per-views, if you go back on the network right now and pick any random shows from the 80s and even into the 90s, into the mid to late 90s, how many shows are you going to find where, and I find myself doing this too, especially in old Royal Rumble matches, where I'm like, dead, 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 dead. It's like I see dead people, and it makes me sad. It's like, I mean, look, time goes by, people get older, some people are going to pass away, but not this many. Find me another industry that's like that. There is none.